Okay, now that you're finished with the questions for the Compromise of 1850, you know that slavery continues to cause division after the U.S. gains Mexico territory in 1848. So, this compromise, the Compromise of 1850, was a way to admit California as a free state while allowing the rest of the Western territories to decide by popular sovereignty whether or not they allowed slaves. This means that they decided on voting in their territory. Um, to pacify, to make the slave states happy, this also includes the Fugitive Slave Act. And this act requires the northern states to return runaway slaves to the South. So you can see here, these are runaway slaves in 1862. The Georgia Platform was created because so many Georgians opposed the compromise, and Georgia threatened secession. So in December of 1850, the lawmakers met to discuss the issues that they adopted in the Georgia Platform. Um, this platform states that Georgia is willing to remain in the Union as long as the North complied with the Fugitive Slave Act, and that they would stop trying to ban slavery in new territories and new states. We're going to click over to the video.
Pinsker. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Compromise of 1850. In 1850, things are way more complicated than before because it's the aftermath of the Mexican War with the acquisition of territory in the West in an era of great sectional strife. This is right after the gold rush in California of 1849, and there's an awful lot of pressure over what to do about admitting a state in the West that doesn't have a history of slavery and might alter the sectional balance between slave and free states in the U.S. Senate. And in January of 1850, a senator named Henry Clay, who's famous as a compromiser in American history, he offered a package of proposals to try to adjust the sectional debate between the country over this issue. And the debate in the Senate was fierce and intense, some of the most dramatic scenes in American history. And they turned over the architecture, the engineering of this compromise package to Stephen Douglas, a younger senator from Illinois, a Democrat. And Douglas decided that the only way to get enough support for all of the different elements of the compromise was to break it apart and treat it separately. When it achieved final form as a series of separate bills in the fall of 1860, there were only 5 bills. One was about the admission of California as a state, a free state. One was about the organization of the Southwest Territories, New Mexico and Utah, without regard to slavery. One was about the adjustment of the border with Texas and New Mexico. One was about the elimination of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And the 5th and final bill, and most important for Southerners, a tougher federal fugitive slave law. Afterwards, enough people were relieved that they felt like they had achieved a kind of compromise, but most historians realize it was a shaky one at best. And even though it appeared for a couple of years that it would succeed, very quickly the fabric of this so-called compromise of 1850 fell apart.
Young people in large numbers.
Okay, so this leads us into the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas and Nebraska were both originally free territories. This changed when Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This act allows territories to vote on whether or not they wanted to allow slavery. North is angry because this compromises, or this area, the northern area, should be free according to the Missouri Compromise. Remember, with the Missouri Compromise, anybody above that line that they drew enters as free states. So you can see the line here from the Missouri Compromise. Oops, sorry. We're talking about the Nebraska Territory, Kansas Territory. The Missouri Compromise states that anyone coming in north of that line should be free states. Okay. More and more people are moving to Kansas to influence the vote. There is fighting that's going on. The fighting becomes so violent that the territory becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. In the end, Kansas is admitted as a free state, and this act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, greatly divides our nation, and it destroys the Missouri Compromise. You see the people fighting.
Today, when people complain about the state of American politics, they often mention the dominance of the Democratic and Republican parties, or the sharp split between red and blue states. But while it may seem like both of these things have been around forever, the situation looked quite different in 1850, with the Republican Party not yet existing, and support for the dominant Democrats and Whigs cutting across geographic divides. The collapse of this second party system was at the center of increasing regional tensions that would lead to the birth of the Republican Party, the rise of Abraham Lincoln as its leader, and a civil war that would claim over 500,000 lives. And if this collapse could be blamed on a single event, it would be the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The story starts with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. To balance the number of slave states and free states in the Union, it allowed slavery in the newly admitted state of Missouri, while making it off-limits in the remaining federally administered Louisiana Territory. But compromises tend to last only as long as they're convenient, and by the early 1850s, a tenacious Democratic senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas found its terms very inconvenient. As an advocate of Western expansion, he promoted constructing a transcontinental railroad across the northern plains with an eastern terminus in Chicago, where he happened to own real estate. For his proposal to succeed, Douglas felt that the territories through which the railroad passed would have to be formally organized, which required the support of Southern politicians. He was also a believer in popular sovereignty, arguing that the status of slavery in a territory should be decided by its residents rather than Congress. So Douglas introduced a bill designed to kill two birds with one stone. It would divide the large chunk of incorporated land into two new organized territories, Nebraska and Kansas, each of which would be open to slavery if the population voted to allow it. While Douglas and his Southern supporters tried to frame the bill as protecting the political rights of settlers, horrified Northerners recognized it as repealing the 34-year-old Missouri Compromise, and feared that its supporters' ultimate goal was to extend slavery to the entire nation. Congress was able to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but at the huge cost of bitterly dividing the nation, with 91% of the opposition coming from Northerners. In the House of Representatives, politicians traded insults and brandished weapons until a sergeant-at-arms restored order. President Pierce signed the bill into law amidst a storm of protest. While Georgia's Alexander Stephens, future Confederate vice president, hailed the act's passage as glory enough for one day, the New York Tribune reported, "The unanimous sentiment of the North is indignant resistance." Douglas even admitted that he could travel from Washington, D.C. to Chicago by the light of his own burning effigies. The political consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act were stunning. Previously, both Whigs and Democrats had included Northern and Southern lawmakers united around various issues. But now slavery became a dividing factor that could not be ignored. Congressmen from both parties spoke out against the act, including an Illinois Whig named Abraham Lincoln, denouncing the monstrous injustice of slavery in an 1854 speech. By this time, the Whigs had all but ceased to exist, irreparably split between their Northern and Southern factions. In the same year, the new Republican Party was founded by the anti-slavery elements from both existing parties. Although Lincoln still ran for Senate as a Whig in 1854, he was an early supporter of the new party and helped to recruit others to its cause. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was shaken when events in the newly formed Kansas Territory revealed the violent consequences of popular sovereignty. Advertisements appeared across the North, imploring people to emigrate to Kansas to stem the advance of slavery. The South answered with border ruffians, pro-slavery Missourians who crossed state lines
to vote in fraudulent elections and raid anti-slavery settlements. One Northern abolitionist, John Brown, became notorious following the Potawatomi Massacre of 1856, when he and his sons hacked to death 5 pro-slavery farmers with broadswords. In the end, more than 50 people died in Bleeding, Kansas. While nominally still a national party, Douglas's Democrats were increasingly divided along sectional lines, and many Northern members left to join the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln finally took up the Republican Party banner in 1856 and never looked back. That year, John C. Fremont, the first Republican presidential candidate, lost to Democrat James Buchanan, but garnered 33% of the popular vote, all from northern states. 2 years later, Lincoln challenged Douglas for his Illinois Senate seat, and although he lost that contest, it elevated his status among Republicans. Lincoln would finally be vindicated in 1860 when he was elected President of the United States, defeating in his own home state a certain Northern Democrat who was finally undone by the disastrous aftermath of the law he had masterminded. Americans today continue to debate whether the Civil War was inevitable, but there is no doubt that the Kansas-Nebraska Act made the ghastly conflict much more likely. And for that reason, it should be remembered as one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history.
Okay, so another event that took place is the Dred Scott case in 1857. Dred Scott is a slave in Missouri. He sued for his freedom from his master because he lived for a period of time in Illinois and Wisconsin, which are both free states. When he returns to Missouri, he sues the state on the belief that his time in the free states made him a free man. Here's Dred Scott right here. Okay. This court case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and of course the court rules on the side of Missouri because the court says that slaves and freed blacks are not citizens in the U.S., so they didn't have the right to sue in the first place. So this makes all the abolitionists furious in the North because it means that slave owners can keep their slaves in any state. And the Southerners are pleased with this decision. For the election of 1860, this is another issue that caused the Civil War. It talked about this a little bit with President Lincoln in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Republican Party forms in 1854. Initially, this party seeks out to restrict slavery in the new states and territories, not outlaw it where it already existed. But in 1860, the Republicans nominate Abraham Lincoln as their candidate for president. The Democratic Party splits between 3 different candidates. Abraham Lincoln wins on November 6, 1860. Of course, the southern states are concerned because they feel he wants to end slavery. This is kind of like the final straw. So South Carolina decides to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. So the White House, President Lincoln's inauguration. I'll skip these videos because we're running out of time. South Carolina decides to secede from the Union. Georgia's kind of divided on the matter. The governor wants to leave the Union right away, whereas Alexander Stephens is disagreeing and warns that what would happen to their economy from the Civil War. However, on January 19th, 1861, they vote to leave the Union. Alexander Stephens, who is he? A lawyer from Crawfordville, Georgia. After the election of 1860 and the succession debate, he supports staying with the United States. However, he is chosen as one of Georgia's representatives to the Confederate Congress, and then he's elected as Vice President of the Confederate States of America. After the war, he's jailed for 5 months. He's elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He's elected as governor of Georgia, and Stephens County is named in his honor.